Today, I get to show you something that the rest of the world has only speculated about until now. On this episode of Sacred Voyager, we have a true world exclusive, the first close-up footage of the mysterious ancient alien skulls of Malta. I'm taking you right to the source with the real skulls in an exclusive exhibit at the National Museum in Valletta, Malta. And you'll be shocked when we go deep into the hidden history that they tried so hard to suppress. The widely rumored alien skulls of Malta are something that have been speculated about in hidden history and conspiracy circles for decades. But what are they? And has there truly been a concerted effort to keep them hidden? I've never been satisfied with how this topic was treated, and I've certainly never seen a video that scratched my itch for wanting to know more. So today, we're going to go deeper into this topic than you've ever seen.
It's Museum of Tarot giving you the best of Europe right in the back door. Going straight at it. We're not even lubing up.
Sometimes if you want something done right, you gotta do it yourself. And I'm certainly not going to perpetuate any flim-flam or sleight of hand by the mainstream archaeologists and historians. They've held the mic for far too long and given themselves their own platform to push their agendas and control their narrative. And this is all born out of their own little petty agendas and nonsense that nobody else cares about. So as far as I'm concerned, they can just sit themselves out like good little boys and girls while you and I, the adults in the room, discuss the truth. And those truths may paint a completely different picture of human history than you've been told. I first heard about these skulls well over 25 years ago as a young researcher in the late 1990s. That was back in the good old days of the internet when we had Netscape Navigator and Hamster Dance and my knees still worked, but you youngins with your skibbity probably wouldn't understand. Back then there was like no follow-up information about this. There was the word of one or two researchers that seemed to have gotten their hands on these before they were hidden away from public view, and that was it. Then you didn't even know if the word of those researchers was true or not. Specifically, it all seems to go back to the word of Dr. Anton Mifsud, who broke this story to the world. And we'll talk more about Dr. Mifsud in a moment. And over the ensuing 20 years, you would see books start to trickle out that might make mention of the Maltese skulls, but they were just regurgitating the same original story in a very early version of what we see with social media today, where somebody takes a trust me bro story and then they play telephone with it. So in the end, the only thing that researchers like myself had to go off of was that original story and Dr. Mifsud's original pictures, which there was like 3 or 4 of those from the late 1990s, and they honestly weren't very good. So I was SOL for many years trying to follow up on this. That is until something very serendipitous and fortuitous happened just a few months ago. As many of you know, we here at Museum of Tarot take several expeditions a year to various sacred sites all over the world. We take our equipment out and our devices to test them in the field, and we do measurements on the site, and we shoot content for you. Well, last year I spent a month cruising around the Mediterranean, going to oracle sites like Delphi, going to the pyramids, going to Ephesus, going to Templar sites. And one of the locations that I visited was Malta. Now, I'd love to tell you that I'm just so damn brilliant that I had this figured out ahead of time, but how it occurred is that I hired a driver and a guide to take us around to the megalithic sites and then take us to the National Museum. And I asked specifically ahead of time whether or not it was possible to see these skulls, if they knew anywhere, any museums where they were being exhibited. And the answer was no, they hadn't seen them in years, they knew about them, but nobody had access to them. Well, I walk into the National Museum in Valletta, I walk over to the back staircase, and right there on the staircase is a big old sign saying that they have the skulls on exhibit on the 2nd floor. So I run upstairs, and sure enough, they have a whole exhibit and room set up with these skulls that nobody even knew were there. I even went downstairs to ask the caretaker what was the deal with this because there was no notice that these were out for exhibit anywhere. And he said that they had just put them up the week before, and that I was one of the first people to get to see them, and that they really hadn't had many people visit the exhibit at all. And sure enough, I was up there for well over an hour, and nobody even came to the second floor. I had the entire place to myself. Now, as the story goes, these skulls were up on public view until the mid-1990s, and then they were hidden away in long-term storage, and nobody got access to them. Not the public, not researchers and physiologists, and that's why they took on such a conspiratorial aspect, that it seemed that they were actively being covered up, and in fact, they really were. Now, that should give you some idea of how extraordinarily unlikely this event was of me finding these things here, that they had been hidden for over 30 years, and I just show up when they happen to be on public display. So if you're looking for proof that serendipities exist, that there's some force up there that wants us to have the truth, something just happened to plop me there on the right day with the right equipment so I could capture the best footage that's ever been taken of these skulls and bring it to you. So let me give you some background and what's actually been claimed about these skulls, and what makes them so special. To do this, we need to reference the work of the gentleman that I mentioned earlier, Dr. Anton Mifsud. Dr. Mifsud is a uniquely qualified medical professional and expert in physiology. He's been a professor and medical consultant through the University of Malta and has worked with various hospitals in Malta. And he's worked extensively on Maltese archaeology with the local archaeological community as well as various excavations. Now, as somebody with a background in neuroscience and neurophysiology, I find his scientific work and physiological work on these skulls to be exemplary. It's excellent. He's not a kook, he's not a crazy, he's not a conspiracy theorist or an alternative history revisionist, and it's a shame that his work has only been given attention within that world. But as he himself has unfortunately discovered, not having biases and wanting to present information as it exists often goes against the agendas and biases of those petty tyrants who are in charge of archaeological narratives. I've often said that archaeologists are just trust fund babies who couldn't succeed in STEM disciplines, and that nobody with any real intelligence would have chosen a profession that pays less than a homely cam girl. Dr. Mifsud's got some crazy stories about being actively sabotaged and cock-blocked by archaeologists who don't want people to examine these skulls. And Dr. Mifsud has gone all over the Maltese areas, islands, and excavations and found these skulls and where they ended up in the world, including repositories in England where the archaeologists from Malta tried to get him blocked from accessing them. And his experiences reflect what I've personally seen going to the various sites on Malta and seeing propaganda that is meant to get people interpreting the sites differently than what the evidence actually points to. And when I show you these things, it will be obvious to you that there is, in fact, a cover-up going on. It begs the question, what is so troubling and politically problematic about what Dr. Mifsud has exposed about the physiology of these people? I'll just level with you. It shows very clearly that there was a different type of human being that was living on Malta until relatively recently, just a few thousand years ago. And that type of human being had different physiology, potentially very different mental characteristics and abilities, and that those people built the megalithic structures that we currently see in Malta and potentially throughout the world. But what might be taboo about this is that these people are not the same as modern Maltese or even modern people throughout the Mediterranean. Something either natural came through and destroyed them, or another people came through, genocided and destroyed the civilization, and then replaced them. The remains that were found under extremely gruesome conditions that could only have been something calamitous. I understand that these are extreme and rather troubling claims, but there's proof for it. So let's explore deeper. The most striking anomaly and the first thing everybody notices about these skulls are their shapes. These skulls are often described as elongated, but that's incorrect. These skulls are not elongated, they are long-headed naturally. Now pay attention to this subtle difference, because I've noticed after looking at all of this for decades, that these days it has become more and more in vogue to refer to skulls like these as elongated, even though that is a very subtle form of verbal programming, neurolinguistic programming, meant to make you infer something, think something about these skulls that isn't true. The term elongated programs your subconscious to make you think that these skulls were artificially stretched out through something like head binding or cradle boarding, and that's just not the case. You'll still find people who will argue with you that these skulls and skulls like them have been artificially deformed, even though there is evidence, such as fetuses with long skulls that were found in their mother's womb, that point to the fact that they were born very naturally that way. And this programming must be working because I've seen over the last 100 years, I have original excavation reports from some of these sites, where they refer to the skulls as long-headed. And over the decades, it has subtly become elongated as a way to propagandize the public to not pay attention to what these people actually are. It's always been funny to me to have a historical perspective that allows me to see the changing of terms and wordplay that gradually changes the way the public thinks. George Carlin warned us about it, and this is used all the time when propagandizing ancient history and interpretations of archaeology. But I digress. The fact is that there's even an anatomical term for such natural long-headedness. It's called dolichocephaly. Skull measurements basically fall into three types: brachycephalic, mesocephalic, and dolichocephalic. This is referred to as the cephalic index, the ratio of the breadth to the length of the skull. And basically any skull that has that ratio, the cephalic index of breadth to length of approximately 75% or less, is considered long-headed or dolichocephalic. You'll often find information about these people all over the world being hidden behind this term dolichocephalic, so if you're ever looking to research the places they found these people in scientific literature, look up that term and you'll find them all over the place. Modern Mediterranean people, and especially Maltese people, tend to have skulls that are much more rounded, much more brachycephalic. So it's very obvious when you know what you're looking at that these ancient people, these ancient skulls that were found all over those islands, is a very different population of people than the modern population that's there now. So no, these skulls and these people were not artificially stretching their skulls out. You better put your paws up, baby, because they were born that way. I'm sorry for that joke. I can't stand Lady Gaga.
Abracadabra!
There's indication that these people had made it all over the world, and certainly all around Europe and the Mediterranean. Such long-headed skulls have been found from the pyramids in China all the way through Western Europe. They were the ruling caste of the Goths and the Huns, and the Old Kingdom dynasties and pharaohs of Egypt. And the royal Inca of Peru, with their long heads, have been found to have DNA linkage with Eastern Europe. And they didn't come across on the Siberian land bridge. They sailed there, which is yet another inconvenient truth that archaeologists don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. These people have mostly been wiped out and made extinct, but there have been some vestiges that survived into the modern day, such as the Burgundians in southern France. Such long-headedness is not the only anatomical anomaly that was found among the Maltese skulls. It's been claimed that these skulls did not have the same cranial sutures as what we would consider a normal human skull. And this is absolutely true, and I'll show you proof of it in a second, but first some basic anatomy. At birth, the normal human skull is composed of 32 separate bones that is held together by a fibrous material that make the skull malleable. This ability for the infant skull to bend and flex aids in the birthing process, and it's why you'll see babies come out of their mother and they push through and they've got a weird shaped head that often goes into a normal shape in a couple of weeks or months. As we age, these natural joints close up and develop bone in a process called ossification. And in cases of artificial head binding or elongation, you'll see them take the child and start to wrap their head or cradle board them in an attempt to stretch out the head, taking advantage of this natural phenomena. And what makes our ancient friends from Malta so intriguing is that in some of the skulls, they are missing what we would consider normal sutures, and in others, they have extra sutures. Specifically, in what we would consider a normal skull, we would see a coronal suture that runs from side to side and a sagittal suture that meets the coronal suture and runs from front to back. And in this skull, referred to by the museum as skull 32954, we can see that there's absolutely no sagittal suture. I have seen archaeologists try to argue against this missing suture by saying that it has simply been obliterated. Now, the physiological term obliteration means that when a suture closes up as we age, it has been compressed and has been ossified and boned over, and that it closes up significantly. But what the archaeologists always leave out is that even with complete obliteration, as we see the stages of closure, complete obliteration still leaves a scar that is very noticeable. You can always tell that a suture had been there in the first place. And one key fact that the archaeologists can never explain is why there is still a coronal suture but no sagittal suture. The body doesn't discriminate what sutures it wants to close up, it would close them both up. So why does one still exist but the other one is supposedly obliterated? It's a complete nonsense argument. And as we get right up close to skull 32954 with a macro lens, you can see the individual pores and you can tell that the suture didn't just close up, it never existed in the first place. Up until now, nobody's ever had close-up pictures of these skulls, so it was all up in the air and open for speculation. But I trust that this actual, irrefutable evidence is enough to satisfy even the harshest critics. And if anyone is still so delulu that they want to whine and tap dance their way out of the obvious, then you can address your critique to Professor Suck-on-D's Nuts. And be sure to ask the nice man for a grant while you're at it, because the rest of us adults haven't had to beg for an allowance since we were 10 years old. And not to get too off topic from the skulls in the museum, but in other Maltese excavations they found skulls that have additional sutures that are not commonly found in other people. In a very small percentage of the population, you'll find an additional suture called the metopic suture, which runs from the coronal suture down the frontal bone in the front of the head. And they found these in some of the Maltese longheads as well. It's somewhat of a suture grab bag. In some skulls you have a missing sagittal suture. In others you have the existence of a metopic suture. In others you've got a combination of both. And something that I've never seen mentioned anywhere else is that in other skulls there don't seem to be sutures at all. Nobody likes to draw attention to this one, but in skull 32956 there don't appear to be any sutures. And I got way up close with this skull with macro photography, and just like the sagittal suture on 32954, I didn't see anything. I'm just going to speculate here, but does this mean that there was an initial population of longheads that didn't have sutures, and that somehow or another they interbred with other people and created variations in how many sutures they had? I don't know, but all I can say is that for the ones that didn't have sutures, it must have been bad to be a Maltese long-headed dude, because she must have had a real big hoo-ha to let the baby's head out. It's just hot dogs down hallways or obelisks in dolmens or whatever fun megalithic joke you want to make. My anaconda don't want none from your big dolmen, son. Another anomaly that goes along with this is the existence of extra holes in the skull. These holes at the back of the skull are called the parietal foramen, and generally people have two of them. They're an opening for something called the emissary vein, and they're essential in blood flow into the brain and cooling. As you can see, this person had three, so more blood flow, better ability to cool. And this skull, 32951, is shown to have larger cranial capacity, so we could assume that perhaps larger brain meant it needed more blood flow. Skull 32951 is also kind of funny because it's the victim of some of that archaeological flim-flam and sleight of hand that I mentioned earlier. You've seen me pull out this brochure. This is just their propaganda brochure from the exhibit. And if we go to this section, it says trepanation or foramina. What their argument is here is that they state that there have been claims made about skull 32951 that it shows evidence of something called trepanation, that is to say, ancient brain surgery. And to try to debunk this, they show an example of trepanation from a skull from Germany and say that, oh, these three holes on the back of skull 32951 are very obviously for the parietal foramen. They don't look anything like the brain surgery that was done to this other skull. And they're right, but they're also lying to you by omission, because what they don't do is show you the front of the skull that shows very obvious signs of trepanation. The way you tell if ancient trepanation was successful is you take a look at the hull and you see if there's been additional bone growth in the skull that is closing up the hull. Skull growth takes quite a bit of time, it takes many years, and this hole is very obviously being closed in around it. So it wasn't something that happened during the excavation where a pickaxe hit it or something like that and opened up a hole. This is a trepanation skull that is being healed over. So it looks like they were performing successful brain surgery as well. And the most interesting part about that is that we find this in the Old Kingdom Egyptians as well as the South American Peruvian Inca. So if these were in fact the same people, was there a sharing of medical technology and techniques among them across generations? When I was studying neuroscience at university, one of the first talks was the professor telling us that the Egyptians were doing brain surgery, but it was this big historical mystery because they seemed to show up one day and know how to perform a brain surgery and not kill the guy. And they didn't know where that lineage of medical knowledge came from. So is this part of it? Brain surgery like this, trepanation, is an oddly specific thing for two cultures to be sharing that supposedly didn't have any contact. Yet another interesting anomaly about these skulls is that some of them are significantly thicker than normal, something called hyperostosis, which is a fancy pants medical term meaning a lot of bone, which is exactly how your mama likes it. Another type of hyperostosis that we see is called parodic hyperostosis, which is all of these little holes on the outside of the skull. And this is linked to something called thalassemia, which is a type of inherited anemia. There are different types and severities of thalassemia. There's a type that will kill you before you're 2 years old, and there's a type that you can live out your life with. But in all types, you are anemic, you are short on iron, your body can't assimilate iron correctly, and it's a disease that affects the hemoglobin of the blood. Now I'm going to tell you some other characteristics of people with advanced thalassemia, and you see if it sounds familiar. They tend to be very gaunt. They tend to be super white. They're very pale because of the blood disorder. They tend to crave things that are very high in iron, like blood and undercooked meats. They tend to be very low energy, and especially during the day when it's very hot outside, and they tend to sleep during the day and be up at night. And this starts to sound like some of the legendary characteristics of some other mysterious creatures that we're all familiar with. And the damnedest thing is that you find these characteristics among the Old Kingdom pharaohs of Egypt and ruling dynasty, and among the Amarna clan who came back and wrestled power away from foreign invaders to take Egypt back over. The Amarna clan were Tutankhamun's family in Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun had many of these characteristics. And if I may speculate, you also start to see trends in what these people valued culturally. You see a lot of nocturnal rituals among the priestly and ruling class. You start to see the adoption of the sacredness of cattle, which would have been a staple food that is high in iron. And you also start to hear some interesting folklore, such as the drinking of blood and the use of the female menses as a supplement among this same ruling caste. These things are high in iron and also in neurotransmitters, which would be very useful to attain altered states of consciousness during those same nocturnal rituals. And if we believe the claims of the modern ruling caste that they trace their ancestry to these same ancient rulers, perhaps the interbreeding among these groups has passed on these characteristics to the modern age, and such tales of vampiric rituals and vampiric practices aren't so far-fetched.
As we've just seen, there is definitely some weirdness going on with these skulls, but we haven't discussed the best parts yet. Earlier in the video, I strongly suggested that there has been an ongoing cover-up about these skulls, and I stand by that for some very good reasons. These skulls that we've been discussing in the museum in Valletta are taken from one specific site, the Hypogeum of House Lafleni. And I know some of you have heard about this underground megalithic chamber known as a hypogeum that is just outside of Valletta. This hypogeum is an underground acoustic chamber that has drastic effects on human consciousness, but we're going to do an entire episode about that in the very near future. For now, what you need to understand is that modern archaeologists are calling this an underground burial chamber, which is complete horse crap. What was found after they rediscovered the chamber were the disjointed, ripped-apart bodies of hundreds, if not thousands of people, these long-headed people, that were either washed inside the chamber and sedimented into layers, trapped inside the chamber and flooded over and then sedimented into layers, or genocided and the bodies thrown into the chamber to dispose of them and then washed over and sedimented by floods over the years. They weren't burials. Calling them burials is some of that funny propaganda wordplay that archaeologists like to do. Calling them burials is like calling the pink slime that they used to make McNuggets a corpse. It's not. These things were completely ripped apart. They were obliterated. They were trapped inside, thrown inside, whatever, disposed of inside of this chamber in a morass of death. This was not something that culture was doing because it was honorable to do to their dead. Many people who have regurgitated this story over the years have regurgitated the propaganda and talking point that there were 7,000 bodies found within the hypogeum. And that's not true either. That's based on an early estimate by one of the early people who excavated the site, Themistocles Zamet, doing a calculation based on how many knee bones he found in a certain area and then extrapolating out to the size of the chamber and coming up with a rough estimate of how many bodies could be within the chamber. That being said, it's actually crazier than 7,000 bodies found. Themistocles Zamet was not the first person to excavate that site. He was the second that we know of. The first person who officially excavated that site was Jesuit Father Emmanuel Magri in 1903 to 1907. Magri mysteriously died or was killed and poisoned, as the story goes, and Themistocles Zamet came in afterwards in 1907 and continued on his excavations. Good old Father Magri, in typical Jesuit fashion, was awfully shady about what he was doing. He did his excavations with no notes, we're told. And what he was doing was taking the remains that he found in that chamber, pulling them out, and grinding them up and giving them to local farmers to spread around and fertilize their fields. Father Magri was called away on a last-minute mission to another Maltese island and, mysteriously died, and whatever notes he may have taken completely disappeared. There's no record whatsoever. And then Zamet came in and started finding the remnants of what Magri had destroyed. You should be smelling something a little fishy right now. We're told officially that Magri and then Zamet were the first two people to excavate the site. But let me pull out my notebook here with some facts that I want to make sure I get these dates and names right. The first time that the museum admits that they knew about the site was 1903. It's the first official record. But there was a Malta Mail article of catacombs being discovered there in 1844. And then Augustus Bartoso repeated that discovery in 1894. And then the museum comes along in 1903 and claims that they were found then for the first time, and then Magri was brought in, and then Magri died, and then Zamet was brought in, and then they did the official excavations. So there's verifiable evidence that 59 years before the Archaeology Museum admits that they knew about the site, that other people had found it. It's written and documented. But it gets even stranger than that, because they found in the stratified layers the coins of the Knights of St. John. One coin, one example, and it had to have been deposited between 1741 and 1773. And this is where the secret society cover-up comes in. That coin from the Knights of St. John was for the Grand Master, Manuel Pinto de Fontesca. You killed my father, prepare to die. Manuel de Fontesca was the Grand Master from 1741 to 1773. He was also of Portuguese descent, comes from a family that was a Knights Templar family. If you haven't seen my other videos about the Knights Templar in Portugal and their continuation as the Order of Christ, you're going to want to check that out after this video. No, the Knights Templar were not eradicated like the story goes. They continued on in Portugal as the Order of Christ and went all over the world discovering all kinds of things. And Fontesca comes from one of those families. Fontesca was also friends with and initiated personally by the then Grand Master of the Illuminati, the actual real historical Illuminati in Naples, Italy, Raimondo de Sangro, the Count of Sansevero. Now, if any of you have a snake plant around the house, a Sansevieria, they were named after this same Illuminati Grandmaster, the Count of San Severo. Why? Because he was an alchemical grandmaster. He was trying to figure out the secrets of everlasting life through illumination. And these plants, aside from the serpent symbolism, you can't kill the things. You barely have to water them. They'll last forever, and they'll just keep on going. There's your funny little piece of alchemical/Illuminati history and trivia. Anyway, the Knights of St. John are also known as the Knights of Malta. The Maltese cross, that's their cross. That's their heraldry. They are the main military order on Malta. The National History Museum was one of their commanderies. So they knew about it at some point 150 years earlier than anybody else. Either they were the ones that killed these people off, took the area over, threw them all in there, buried them, and then buried the hypogeum and covered it up, or they had been doing excavations and knew about that site and covered it up. Either way, there's some funny business going on here. Now you might look at me and say, wait, Museum of Tarot guy, how can you possibly be insinuating that this ancient megalithic civilization had any contact whatsoever with the more modern Knights of St. John? One does not simply walk into Mordor. Well, it's not entirely clear to me that these skulls and these remains were ever adequately dated in an unbiased fashion. And we know that the Order of St. John was the Knights Hospitaller at one point, and they took over the island and fought for it back and forth with the Ottomans. But was there anybody there before that they got rid of in order to take over those islands? We never hear that part of the story. But what we do know is that people with this same long-headedness were eradicated during other crusades, such as the Albigensian Crusade in France. I mentioned earlier in this video that this long-headedness appears in other populations in France, such as the Burgundians. But a little-known fact about the Cathars, the Albigensians that were eradicated during the Albigensian Crusade, is that they had this same long-headedness. It was known as the Toulouse deformity. So it looks to me like these various military orders and crusades were going around the world, killing these people off. The Albigensian Cathars were the competition to the modern church, and their story is better told in another video. But if these people on Malta were related somehow, and they went through such efforts to hide the skulls, prevent proper analysis, to grind them up and throw them in the farmers' fields and hide evidence, you gotta wonder, were they hiding a genocide? Were they hiding it behind the idea that these people were more ancient than they actually were? And the hypogeum, House of Flenny, isn't the only hypogeum in the area. In fact, there's one just a couple of blocks away named Santa Lucia, the Saint of Light, that has been completely covered up, where they supposedly found even more bodies. The existence of Santa Lucia has been so suppressed that even people who know about House of Flenny don't realize that it exists. And it's interesting because if you go there today, it just looks like an abandoned lot in between some buildings with a rusty old fence around it. There used to be a sign there that indicated that there was a hypogeum there. You can't even read the sign anymore. And that's interesting because there were more remains found in Santa Lucia than House of Flenny just a couple blocks away. And House of Flenny is this major big deal with major security systems and a building built around it, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the main and most popular attractions in Malta and the Mediterranean, and you don't hear anything about the more significant site literally just a couple blocks away. And of the many thousands of other remains and long skulls that they found at Santa Lucia, they all went missing. But wait, there's more. Santa Lucia itself is just another couple of blocks away from a hill that is now a cemetery. And on that site, they were finding these same long-headed people. And historically, to the locals, that hill was known as Tel Hor, the Mountain of Horus, which is your connection right back to Egypt. And you never hear anything about that in the guidebooks. And isn't that funny? Because to me, just some dumbass on the internet, it looks to me like there's some pretty good circumstantial evidence that the Brotherhood Network, the Knights of Malta / St. John, knew all about House of Flenny a long time before anybody acknowledged. And either they excavated the site and dropped a coin, or somebody did some dirty business there and dropped a coin. But Either way, they kept it hush-hush for 150 years. Even though other people had been finding it in the meantime, nobody ever acknowledged it. Until the Jesuits came in and they brought their own guy in to do a cover-up and dispose of evidence. And they lost all his papers, and then they killed him. And then they brought in another schmuck to do the cleanup work after that, and he wrote the official history that all the modern historians and archaeologists go off of, but those same modern historians are still covering up the evidence and still hiding skulls away for decades, and still keeping their own countrymen, people who do this professionally for a living at the local university, from seeing these skulls. Now, does that seem like a cover-up to you? To wrap this all up, there is one subject that we haven't touched on yet, and that's all of the speculation about whether these people were aliens. Were they watchers? Were they fallen angels? Were they Nephilim? Well, when you go to the museum and you go to the exhibition, they've got a gray alien up on the wall, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, making fun of that idea. And you'll see them do certain things like this there and at the House of Flenny Hypogeum, where they're basically poking fun at people who want to believe these things. Now, given the fact that the archaeologists and historians themselves are trying to explain these things away with tall tales and fantasies that are every bit as ridiculous as something that came out of Eric von Daniken, I think that their approach and their attitude towards it is extremely juvenile and in poor taste. There's one last fact that I haven't told you about, and that has to do with House of Flenny, the underground chambers where they found these skulls. Now, House of Flenny is multiple stories deep and has many different rooms. Many of these rooms also have red ochre paintings on the ceiling and on the walls of various things, depictions, many shamanic visions like you would get in altered states of consciousness, and they're really very beautiful. But the niftiest thing that they found that has since largely been destroyed is a handprint. And that handprint is a very special handprint. Why? Because it has 6 fingers. 6 fingers and 6 toes is what's now known as polydactyly. And as I understand it, 5 fingers and 5 toes is the recessive trait. We are actually the mutation. 6 fingers and 6 toes is closer to what is natural for our genetics. And those are some of the traits, along with long heads, that were attributed to the gods and the rulers and those who came before. But were they aliens that came down in rocket ships, or did they come down in balls of light as energy beings and incarnate by coagulating matter around them until they were a living being? Or were they simply an earlier type of hominid that lived on this planet before us, and perhaps we were bred out of them, like chihuahuas out of wolves, and the chihuahuas out-humped the wolves? Maybe we don't understand this because we were never the smart ones. Maybe we are already living in idiocracy. We just won out because we were more motivated to hump. Guys, truly, I've never written off the idea of ancient aliens when I was looking at all this. I always held space for it in everything I've done over the last 30 years. But I can tell you honestly, I've not seen any indication that these people, the long-headed people, are aliens. There's no indication of rockets, that they came from outer space, or anything like that. But there is indication that they're connected up with other groups of people around the world that were the ruling caste, and that largely that ruling caste was overthrown and obliterated around the world. Does that mean that they were from outer space, or they were fallen angels, or Anunnaki, or Nephilim, and that they were evil and bad and mistreated the people, and the people rose up and got rid of them a la Stargate? No, not necessarily. You'll often find that when narcissistic abusers abuse a person or get rid of a person or do something to a person, they'll come up with reasons to justify why they got rid of that person and crowded them out. And usually it comes down to making up stories and tall tales about how bad those people supposedly were, so they deserved it. In reality, the long-headed people may have been the pacifists. They may have been the good guys in the story, and the rest of the people weren't, and they got rid of them. Sometimes it really does come down to one group wants what another group has, and they have more people and weapons. So there you have it, our deep dive into the alien skulls of Malta. Now, I know I just brought you some new information, some hot takes, and new interpretations of the ancient alien tropes that are floating around everywhere these days, and I'd love to know what you think. Today, it was a pleasure to show you the cleanest and clearest pictures of these skulls that have ever been presented to the public. But I take way too many pictures on trips. It's a problem, I admit it. I have hundreds of pictures of these skulls, so I'll be putting up a lot more on our Museum of Tarot Instagram. Go over there and give us a like and a follow, and I'll also be putting them up on our Museum of Tarot blog on our website. And as always, if you're interested in any of our cutting-edge consciousness-enhancing tools, stop on by museumoftarot.com. We've got things like our Halo Pulsar, my little magnetic biopulsar device that's been pulsing at 10 hertz in my lap while I make this video so I can relax and focus on delivering lines. And we really hope you enjoyed this, the first of our Sacred Voyager series, which will be our ongoing series taking you to explore little-known sites and secrets around the world. This will be the start of us doing a lot more YouTube material. And I know a lot of you have asked for it in the past, and we're over on TikTok mostly, but TikTok's getting terrible, so it's time to migrate over to YouTube. So please, like and follow and share this around so we can start being seen more and I can bring in more content just like this. Thanks for watching our video today. Really hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you again next time.